This is America's Roundtable from Washington, D.C., a weekly radio program with leading voices and influential thinkers representing the academia, business, media, think tanks, and the political arena. I am Joel Anand-Sami, your co-host, joined by Natasha Sardorch, economist and co-founder of the International Leaders Summit. We are pleased to have Dave Shellenberger join us this weekend. Dave Shellenberger is a libertarian commentator on national and international affairs. His website is daveshellenberger.com, and he lives in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Dave is an attorney by background. He was a pioneer in investor rights, representing defrauded investors and calling attention to Wall Street abuse and regulatory failures. As chief of licensing for the Massachusetts Securities Division, he led the national effort to expose fraud and abuse in the day trading industry. He also served as a senior enforcement attorney for the New York Stock Exchange and chief counsel for the New York Office of Securities Regulator, FINRA. A Business Week called him a no-nonsense regulator. Additionally, he was an in-house counsel and executive in the financial services industry. Dave now devotes full time to advancing the cause of liberty. Dave, it's great to have you join us on America's Roundtable.
Thank you very much, Joel. It's a pleasure to be here with you and Natasha.
Welcome, David.
This past week, The Guardian reported, as well as other media outlets, in regard to what is transpiring in Tunisia and Northern Africa. I'd like to read a brief excerpt from The Guardian just to give our listeners an opportunity to understand some of the challenges being faced by the citizens there. The Guardian reported that Tunisia killing turned the spotlight on Arab Spring poster child's mass problems, and I'd like to read this clip for all of us as well. The writer starts out with this statement here. Tunisia provided the first spark of the Arab Spring and became the poster child for its positive achievements. The overthrow of a dictator with relatively little bloodshed, an orderly transition, free elections, and the rise of a long-banned Islamist party that strove for inclusiveness and projected an image of moderation. Compared with instability in Egypt, carnage in Syria, and sporadic violence in Libya, it had been performing fairly well. But the assassination of leading left-wing politician Chokri Belaid, a fierce critic of the Ennahda-led government, has turned the spotlight on Tunisia's serious problems in the most sensational way. The report continues by saying that in October 2011, Ennahda won a free election which produced an assembly in which it has a majority with two secular allies. But it seems that in light of the assassination this past week, the tensions have increased. And our listeners have followed the Jasmine Revolution of Tunisia. And David, what are your observations when looking at the challenges being faced by Tunisia citizens and individuals in Northern Africa? We certainly look forward to your feedback in regard to that.
Yeah, thank you, Joel. I would encourage patience with regard to the region. Americans tend to be impatient. We want results quickly. But if we look at our own history, we can see that change takes time, for better or worse. Tunisia has a continuing great amount of promise. There's great hope for Tunisia based on its history. It has a history of tolerance. It has a well-educated population. It already has democratic institutions in place. It has equal gender rights and a large middle class. And it's the most European country in the region. Thus, it remains one of the most promising countries. I would say that, speaking as an American, we should look for the U.S. government to do no harm and to undo the harm it already does in the region. I don't think the U.S. government can really help the region become freer except by setting an example and ending the conduct that has made things worse, meaning its interventions, its aid to dictators, trade barriers it puts up, things like that.
Well, it's interesting that you've mentioned about the American involvement in Northern Africa, and we have seen some of these issues whereby significant aid being poured into a lot of these countries supported dictatorships and regimes that were authoritarian in nature and repressed independent voices and individuals wanting serious reforms for their fellow citizens. And the whole issue of aid has come up time and time again, where we as American citizens have invested significant dollars into a lot of these countries, and yet we have not learned the lessons that aid does not really support true reforms in some of these countries.
Right. In fact, aid generally makes things worse because it allows governments with bad policies or simply bad governments to continue on their way rather than facing reality. And Egypt is a good example of that. The U.S. continues to pour billions in to support what amounts to a military government, thus discouraging the necessary liberalization of the country. And another point I'd make with regard to the entire region, and particularly Egypt, is that what's needed is economic freedom. Freedom, as you know, is indivisible. The ideal is that there be civil freedom, political freedom, and economic freedom, but probably the most essential freedom is economic, because that leads to the development whereby people become wealthier, more sophisticated, and thus demand civil and political liberty. But democracy is sometimes used as the word describing the goal for the region. In reality, democracy, in my view, is the enemy of freedom. The parable we use is two wolves and a lamb voting what should we have for lunch. You know that the wolves will outvote the lamb, and he will not be happy with the result. So what we really need is a limited government. We need a downsizing of government. We need economic freedom that will allow people to become wealthier and demand more rights.
In fact, for our listeners, Dave, we have been talking about some of these issues in Northern Africa for a number of months. We had Matthew Kaminsky from the Wall Street Journal. He's a member of the editorial board, talk about his experiences being in Egypt and talking to some of the leadership members within the Muslim Brotherhood, political establishment, and looking at the changes taking place there. And also, we talked very openly about the challenges in regard to America's involvement and the question that was in place about U.S. principled response rather than the aid in supporting some of these regimes here. And just for our listeners, I just wanted to take a step back and talk about Tunisia. In fact, Natasha and I both visited Tunisia some years ago, and as you've mentioned too, it had a very vibrant economy. And yet, behind that vibrant economy, there were some challenges that we had observed as well. I'd like to just read an excerpt written by Nassima Noor in the International Affairs Review. She wrote about what triggered this whole Arab revolution, if you want to call it, the Arab uprising that spread not just within Tunisia but across the landscape there. And she writes, on December 17, 2010, a 26-year-old Tunisian, Mohamed Bouazizi, lit the light fuse that ended his life and ignited the current unrest in sweeping the Middle East. Bouazizi, a street vendor, set himself on fire in despair and in protest of his treatment at the hands of local authorities. Earlier, officials had seized his wheelbarrow full of produce and beaten him in public. The tragic circumstances surrounding his death sparked protests in his rural hometown, and the protests, which sometimes turned into violent riots, quickly spread to other areas and the capital, Tunis. The Tunisian government responded first with repression, unleashing state security forces on the demonstrators, arresting activists and shutting down the internet. Eventually, Ben Ali shuffled his cabinet and offered to create 300,000 jobs, but it was a little too late and too little. The protests and violence continued, and by January 14, the president and his family were on an airplane to Saudi Arabia. In the aftermath of Tunisia's Jasmine Revolution, as it has come to be called, some wondered why Ben Ali's regime cracked. And Tunisia was, after all, an oasis of bleak environment in the Middle East. It had a secular identity and friendly relations with the U.S. and Europe. Its economy was more prosperous, its population better educated, and so forth. But as we looked more closely at Tunisia's high rankings on economic and educational and other indicators, they showed a repressive core. And Nassima Noor talks about some of the ways in which Ben Ali controlling the media, blocked civil society organizations, and other issues as well. And it's a compelling argument in the whole aspect of what you've just shared about the importance of economic freedom. And we take that for granted in the West when we think about countries, not just only in Northern Africa, but beyond that region, where In the West, we sort of take it for granted that when countries call themselves democratic nations, that they have free and fair elections, that they have an independent judiciary. But in a great number of countries, there is a lack of the rule of law and protection of property rights. And as you have written much about some of these countries as well, how do we put that together in place to advance economic freedom?
Well, from the perspective, again, of U.S. policy, one important factor is that the U.S. government has its own interests, and those interests often clash with those of the American people. So, for instance, aid to the military government of Egypt or aid to any country is really against the interests of both Americans because that money, of course, is taken from us through debt or taxation, and it's bad for the people living in those countries. So, as you know, what I promote is the influence of ideas so that people around the world can better understand the nature of freedom, the need for freedom, their entitlement to freedom. And one way to do that is through think tanks. So, for instance, in Tunisia, there's the Institute Kheireddine, that's Kheireddine, and it upholds values that I think you and I and your listeners would agree with. To read what its mission statement says, it says, "We are free and responsible not because the state conceded liberty, but because that freedom is the essence of human nature. We believe that the role of the state should be redefined in light of the ideals of freedom." So that's an example of a think tank, and again, this is one focusing on Tunisia that works to educate people. It's apolitical, it's nonpartisan, it's nonprofit, but it's spreading and reinforcing the ideals of liberty. And from my viewpoint, that's what people who seek a freer world can do best. Politics is usually not the answer. Usually it's a matter of education.
It's important to know that Tunisia had 6 decades of secularism.
Right.
And now there is a concern that with Ennahda coming into power, there is a blurry line between political Islam and Islamist violence, because there is an absence, actually from an international point of view also, there seems to be an absence of a reaction to condemn political violence. And what can we do in that respect? Because I don't think think tank can be effective in that area.
Well, what a think tank can do is point out that the climate of violence that we saw in Tunisia, that was warned about even by the poor person who was recently assassinated, was the responsibility of the government. That is, the government was acting politically, as all governments do, and it was tolerating the violence because it was sympathetic to the violence. The violence was against people who opposed the government. It was the person assassinated, as you know, represented a leading opposing party to the plurality now in the parliament in Tunisia. So what we're dealing with is a government failure of one of the fundamental roles that government claims, that is security. So one thing a think tank can do is to point that out and point out that government is often not the answer, and government often fails at even the most fundamental of its tasks, that is providing domestic security. And there is an alternative. Historically, almost everything the government does was done by the private sector. So in areas that are suffering from violence or the threat of violence, I often encourage consideration of an alternative to government providing the security, and that is the market doing so.
And Dave, I think it's so important that you mentioned the significance of think tanks and independent voices, the importance of freedom of speech in a number of these countries, due to the fact that very rarely have we seen support for think tanks and support for independent voices. We do hear about their work, their activities, and what they're doing, but rather than spending our taxpayer dollars and sending it to supporting government regimes and corrupt structures, it certainly would be wise to have a greater support for ideas that promote and advance liberty, that expose some of these greater problems in these countries. And we certainly would like to encourage our listeners to seek out independent think tanks in a number of these countries that they're concerned about or would like to help out, rather than just sending monies to support various activities. It would be certainly wise and prudent to look up some of these think tanks that are doing a great job in their respective countries and engaging a younger generation to advance some of these principled solutions. So we certainly commend you for mentioning the importance of how civil society and think tanks can play a vital role in beginning this important paradigm shift in a lot of these countries that are trying to make that difficult transition from authoritarian regimes or regimes that have not accepted and embraced economic freedom to advance some of these key issues.
I agree. It's important, as you say, to encourage civil society, to encourage the spread of good ideas. And ideas, as you know, have consequences. They're powerful, and over time they change the world.
Indeed. When you think about what sparked the whole revolution throughout the region, it was the individual, just one street vendor who did not want to basically live under the conditions that of a repressive regime, not being able to experience economic freedom, that basically triggered Tunisia's Jasmine Revolution. So how much more can be done when individuals work together and are able to advance the ideas of economic freedom and also liberty itself. In fact, it would be great for us to just segue now into what is happening in another part of the world. And in fact, The Economist magazine last week touted the reforms taking place in the Nordic states, of all places. Over the past few months, we've observed how politicians in Washington, D.C. have touted the urgency of addressing the mounting debt, which is now at $60.5 trillion. Politicians have talked about reducing government expenses and also cutting taxes. But instead, we have seen how legislators in Washington, D.C. and the president himself kick the can down the road once again. And as we looked at what's taking place in the Nordic states, I would just like to read an excerpt from The Economist when they talked about the Nordic countries in a title called The Next Supermodel. In reading this here, I quote, "That is partly because the four main Nordics, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, and Finland, are doing rather well. If you had to be reborn anywhere in the world as a person with average talents and income, you would want to be a Viking. The Nordics cluster at the top of league tables of everything from economic competitiveness to social health to happiness." That's what The Economist states. It also continues by saying they have avoided both Southern Europe's economic problems and America's extreme inequality. Development theories have been calling to success the modernization getting to Denmark. Meanwhile, a region that was synonymous with do-it-yourself furniture and ABBA has even become a cultural haven, home to the Killing, Noma, and Angry Birds. The idea of lean Nordic government will come as a shock both to French leftists who dream of socialist Scandinavia and to American conservatives who fear that Barack Obama is bent on Swedenization. They are out of date, The Economist reports. In the 1970s and 1980s, the Nordics were indeed tax and spend countries. Sweden's public spending reached 67% of GDP in 1993. And in fact, individuals, as it mentions about a specific inventor, Pippi Longstocking, was forced to pay more than 100% of her income in taxes. But tax and spend did not work, The Economist states. Sweden fell from being the fourth richest country in the world in 1970 to the 14th in 1993. The Economist continues, since then, the Nordics have changed course, mainly to the right. Government's share of GDP in Sweden, which has dropped by about 18 percentage points, is lower than France's and could soon be lower than Britain's. Taxes have been cut. The corporate rate is 22%, far lower than America's. And the Nordics have focused on balancing the books. While Mr. Obama and the Congress dither about entitled reforms, Sweden has reformed its pension system and its budget is 0.3% of GDP, while America's is 7%, unquote. It's quite a different picture when you look at the Nordic model and when you look at what's happening in America today, Dave.
Yes, and one reason, again, is based on ideas and culture. And it's always struck me that countries like Sweden, first of all, are smaller. It's easier to turn around a small country, and I give Sweden credit for having been a socialist disaster for now being a lot freer, as you say, with a smaller government, lower taxes, a better culture of accepting the role of free enterprise. The U.S. is a harder country to turn around because it has a strong central government, and as you know, it's the federal government is virtually unconstrained at this point. The Founding Fathers would be horrified at everything that the federal government does. Almost everything it does is unconstitutional based on the original vision of the founders, the original meaning of the Constitution. Sweden has work to do. It's come a long way. It's more of a small family compared to the United States, and I think that's one reason it's been able to be as effective making changes as it has been. Chile's another example of a relatively small country that's turned itself around famously.
Yeah, indeed, it gives a greater sense of focus on the importance of moving and shifting the powers from Washington, D.C. to the respective states, and the importance of states' rights. In fact, Dr. Walter Williams was on the program not too long ago and communicated the importance of states' rights in comparison to what we have today, whereby the federal government is involved in each and every aspect of individuals' lives, and the significant monies that are being sent to Washington, D.C. We're not talking about just the fraud and the spending that is done frivolously, but just the fact that it supports a culture here which is more in tune with corruption rather than serving its citizens. And in fact, as you compare Washington, D.C. and the metro area to the rest of the country, this has become the boom city of America.
Right. The fact that D.C. is booming is a bad sign because it should just be stable or getting smaller in size. Instead, too much wealth is attracted to D.C. It's the government spending, it's the lobbyists. The fact that D.C. is the center of the United States in the way it has become is a negative. Ideal, as you say, you want states to be able to compete, offer freedom, and that thus people will leave. People do vote with their feet. They do vote with their capital. We see people fleeing New York and California, for instance. The problem is, as you say, the fact that the federal government has become so dominant in terms of regulation and taxation means that it's harder for states to compete. The competition is less of a factor.
In just the past couple of months, we've noticed a number of state governors coming forth and talking about slashing taxes. We have had, for example, from Louisiana, Governor Bobby Jindal talk about cutting taxes in Louisiana, talking about making it a more free market economy in what they have since, and actually Bobby Jindal has addressed the issue of corruption in Louisiana. So we're beginning to see some of these states, not just only Louisiana, but other states, including the Commonwealth of Virginia, for example, where governors have begun to take this process of reform to the next level. And as we've always known, is that states are great laboratories for reforms. But how does it translate, and what could governors do, those that are reform-oriented, to begin to raise the question that more of these powers ought to be limited at the federal level so that individuals at the state level can do better and actually prosper?
Cutting taxes, as you say, Joel, is important. I would caution that sometimes governors are talking about cutting tax A and increasing tax B, and what's important is the overall level of taxation, not just the form. The analogy I use is that if there's a burglar in your house, it doesn't help to send them to the garage to steal your car rather than your jewelry. You just want them out of your house.
Indeed.
So in the unlikely event I were a governor, a position that I would decline, I would massively cut taxes. I would massively cut the size of the state government. I would stop funding public schools, and I would refuse all or virtually all federal aid. I would also refuse to cooperate with Obamacare, and I would start nullifying federal legislation. For instance, with respect to the drug wars, certain states are moving towards liberalizing drug use. That is, they're limiting the extent of their regulation and criminalization of drugs, but people are still facing the threat of federal prosecution. So what's legal in California, for instance, in terms of offering medicinal marijuana, is still illegal under federal law. So we have people being prosecuted rather cruelly, in my view, by the federal government for doing what's legal in California. So again, if I were governor of California, I would nullify the federal drug laws. We need people with courage at the state level to resist and push back on the encroachment of the federal government.
We have seen, we moved away from free market system. We are much more in a crony capitalism at the stage. And how should we actually prevent these things from happening? In the last fiscal bill, there were $40 billion of tax payoffs that were dedicated for certain companies, for certain groups that lobbied heavily. So practically, this was already agreed in August last year, and it was passed overnight into the fiscal bill without transparency, without people knowing about it.
Yeah, but this is what politicians do. Politicians take care of themselves. This is what, as you know, is called public choice economics. Politicians take care of themselves, and one way they do that is taking care of special interests. And the public interest is rarely of concern. So this encourages us to be very skeptical. And when it happens at the federal level or with any central government, it's much harder for you or me to influence this. Whereas if it happens at a local and state level, we might have an easier task voting bad people out of office. But the federal level is just a theft fest. They just routinely take care of special interests. As you say, this is crony capitalism. It's a matter of taking care of special interests. It's also known as corporate welfare. It's immoral. It's plunder, in the term of Boss Jet, so-called legal plunder. They're taking money from us, giving it to favored corporations. It's just dead wrong. But they get away with it year after year.
I mean, the senators actually voted down an amendment to list the corporate interests that receive tax breaks on a government website. I mean, this is the minimum transparency the taxpayers should be aware of.
Right. Yeah, they're against anything that would reveal what they're really up to, and what they're up to is taking care of themselves, getting reelected. And you see them in office decade after decade after decade, the same people, which tells you that they're taking actions that allow themselves to get reelected, right, as opposed to what's in the public interest.
Exactly. I mean, as the founding fathers put certain principles in the Constitution and Declaration of Independence, and that those were the lasting principles. Do you see some of the mechanisms that could be applied at this stage to avoid this omnibus legislation, which allows these packages to get in without transparency, to have certain maybe term limits on politicians, to have some mechanisms in how we lobby, how we accept lobbying, and how do we prevent bad things from happening in lobbying, and also some other suggestions in mechanisms that could be imposed?
Sure. I would discourage the regulation of lobbying. The truth is that politicians go after the special interests asking for money. So it's not just a matter of lobbyists hunting down politicians trying to influence things. It's a matter of politicians finding the lobbyists and essentially legally shaking down the special interests for campaign contributions. Mm-hmm. So and lobbying is just an act of free speech. It's just like the campaign finance laws I would discourage because they impinge on free speech. The problem isn't that lobbyists are talking to politicians. The problem is that politicians respond and enact laws that are unfair, protecting those interests. So I'm not sure there's any mechanism that will stop the growth of the federal government. There's an economics to politics which leads to the central government growing and growing and growing. And the primary thing is that politicians will, as I say, take care of themselves, and it's not in their interest to show courage. And the culture of the Congress is cowardice. There are a few outstanding people, such as Rand Paul, but in general, the politicians are unprincipled. All they care about is going along to get along, getting reelected, and that means taking care of special interests. And this is why I've evolved into a person who's very skeptical of government. As soon as you give a group of people the power over your life, they have a purported monopoly on violence and the threat of violence, they're going to grow. There's nothing stopping them. unless you're in a country that's more like a family. But even there, of course, in any country you'll see abuses. And there's no country where the government is too small. In every country in the world, the government is too large, and there are restrictions on freedom. But the U.S. is a very difficult country to turn around because of its size, because of the disparate interests, and because of the fact that the federal government is large.
As Lord Acton said, power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Mm-hmm. And that's what's happening now. So we need to introduce some mechanisms to go back to the original thoughts of founding fathers.
Well, and I would say that if there's any hope of that, it's probably through education. The Constitution isn't self-enforcing. It's just a piece of paper. So absent a culture and a level of character that supports limited government, you're going to have unlimited government, which is essentially what we have. As you know, the news in the past week has included a release of the memorandum from the Department of Justice purportedly justifying Obama's drone strikes, including his purported right to assassinate Americans without due process, or for high officials to do so. Again, the founders would be horrified at this, but you notice that Congress is barely raising a whimper over this. They're making no effort, for instance, to impeach Obama or to introduce legislation to prevent him from doing what's illegal.
Right. And there's been a discussion, robust debates have taken place over the years about the significance of term limits. And there was a member of Congress, Senator Tom Coburn, who communicated to his constituency that he would serve for a number of years, and that would be it. Do you think that it would be beneficial for us to look at term limits in a more serious manner, specifically when we think about Washington, D.C.?
I know, for instance, Joel, that Cato Institute has supported term limits, and Cato's judgment is almost always correct in these matters. But the problem is someone serving even under term limits would still have the same incentive to favor special interests so that he'd be received by the establishment upon leaving office. So my general view is that tinkering with these mechanisms will have no real effect. You still have a bunch of people who are self-interested, and typically the worst people are drawn to politics. Normal people just want to live their lives, engage in trade through exchange of goods and services, or in our world, exchange ideas. But politicians want power. So politics is always going to draw people who have the worst incentives.
Thank you so much indeed for joining us this weekend, Dave, and we certainly hope that you'll be able to plow out of that snowstorm that Boston and New England has experienced, and we trust that we'll be able to continue our discussion on this and many topics that certainly affect our daily lives as citizens of the Republic, as well as those that are interested in what's happening around the world.
Very good. Thank you very much, Joel and Tasha.
Thank you, David.
Bye now.
This is America's Roundtable. Visit us at americasrt.com. Follow us on Twitter at americasrt. You can find us on YouTube and Facebook. Like and share.